When a bunch of shit happens and fuck this gay earth has been missed, it's what the fuck just happened. France, the Gilet Jaunes take to the streets in a massive national paddy over a moderate increase in fuel prices to help the environment. Britain and Brexit continues to be an absolute shit show, with what's essentially a parliamentary civil war currently unfolding. The internet, and finally getting tired of waiting for someone to put it out of its misery, Tumblr takes itself out behind the barn and puts a bullet through its own skull. Bienvenue, willkommen, welcome. Yeah, I've been busy this week, but it's all kicked off, so it seems. So rather than do a fuck this gay earth, let's have a what the fuck happened recap. Let's get into it. You can't really have failed to notice that it's all kicking off in France. Now, cultures are different, and in France they riot and protest at the drop of a hat. It's kind of the national pastime, the same way America's is supposedly baseball. So you have to take anything like this that happens in France with a hefty pinch of salt as to how serious it is. But this does seem genuinely serious. It also seems kind of childish. What is it supposedly over? It's supposedly over a rather modest rise in diesel costs that people are going to have to pay for fuel in order to drive their cars around. Still paying less than the UK. Just saying. Now, this was something of a public relations coup for Macron initially, because he could point to that as something that his government was doing to tackle climate change and could hold that over Donald Trump. More power to him. However, the French government has since backed down for at least 6 months on this issue and won't be rolling out these tax hikes on fuel for at least 6 months. So, there's more to it. There's nuance and so on around it as well. Now, fuel hikes aren't necessarily that great a tool in order to reduce consumption. They do have some effect, but it's relatively small. It's not a particularly effective way to tackle environmental problems as compared with, say, mass investment in alternative energy, electric vehicle infrastructure, subsidies for more fuel efficient cars, electric cars, or they have compressed air cars in France, for example. Yeah, there's all these other options. So it's the quick and lazy options. So that's some of the problem. Another part of the problem is this: it will disproportionately affect rural fuel consumers. Diesel for farm equipment. People who live in rural areas have to travel more because they have to go longer distances to reach places. So this affects them more, and they're not necessarily as affluent as the cities. So perhaps a congestion charge would have been a more sensible way to go about it, to spare the rural areas who need this money and need to have the fuel to run the farms and everything, to keep everyone fed. Those kind of things. There's an underlying problem, though, and since the previous president there's been a kind of Thatcherization going on in France, though this is obviously a relative term. France has a very long history of strong social services, strong social investment and so on. These have been being pared back and stripped back, while taxes haven't been going down proportionately to that. Like most other Western nations, France is facing a demographic crisis. Baby boomers reaching an age where they're no longer working, no longer contributing, birth rates being down, the stresses and strains that immigration is supposedly creating for these countries. So these are all underlying issues, and then, you know, when there's a nice riot, opportunistic people pile in. So there's a lot going on. It's not that simple, but the underlying issues are separate to the trigger issue, which is the fuel prices. This seems like a childish reaction to that. Brexit is continuing to cause all manner of problems in the UK. It's essentially a rolling constitutional crisis that underlines all the fractures and problems that exist within our democracy, the regions, the tussle between the executive, you know, the actual government and parliament, and the people, and all of this. It's just a total clusterfuck. Now, the government had been refusing to publish some of the advice and so on that they'd gotten, legal advice and otherwise, about Brexit, and then Parliament passed a motion saying that they had to. They still refused. They were held to be in contempt of Parliament, and at that point fortunately backed down, because it's not entirely clear what would have happened otherwise. This information that has now been released, along with a lot of other information that's been leaked or released, shows that any kind of Brexit will dry fuck Britain in the ass for years to come, decades probably to come, and various legal things that come down that complicate things for the government. We can unilaterally decide, no, we don't want to Brexit anymore, thank you very much. That can be done. Parliament will have to vote on it, and so there's all these kinds of ways of getting out of it opening up, and a second referendum is becoming more and more likely as time goes on. If there isn't enough time for a second referendum, then Parliament can just vote and say, no, we're not going to do this. And things are coming down to Theresa May's deal that pleases absolutely nobody, Brexiter or Remainer, or remain, possibly via a second referendum, possibly via Parliament, which at least pleases, well, now over half of the population. It was always going to be shit, and Theresa May's deal ties us to Europe for an indefinite period rolling on because of issues like Northern Ireland and others. It's kind of like a reverse Blade when it comes to membership of the EU. We have all of the weaknesses and none of the strengths if we go with Theresa May's deal. If we remain, if we decide after all of this that actually, no, it's not worth wrecking Britain's prospects for decades to come after all, and we're better off in than out, then we get a say. We maintain our sovereignty over our local issues, and we get to participate in EU issues, which we don't if we do go through with it and leave. Especially in a no-deal case, it's even worse than May's deal, which is pretty bad, which ties us to Europe and all of their shenanigans and so on, but without any say, without any veto, without any participation. So the government's been found in contempt of Parliament. That's unusual. I think that's the first time in the modern era that that has happened. They've been forced to publish legal advice. They've been forced to give Parliament the final say on what will happen. So it looks like we have a way out. Now, I know quite a lot of my viewers are pro-Brexit for reasons that still escape me. I've been on a bit of a quest to try and find out why people voted for leave, and it all so far has been nonsense. Either a parochial issue like fishing, less than half of 1% of the UK economy is down to fishing, so that's rather parochial and insular, for all it might be very important in your community, or just mistaken, like the sovereignty issue. We never lost sovereignty, or open borders. Europe doesn't have open borders, either externally as a bloc nor internally. We've always had the opportunity to have controls that we have simply refused to do because of economic necessity. We just blame Europe for it. So I haven't found any good reasons why anyone wanted to leave. It just seems to be an emotional issue, not a pragmatic issue, whereas there are both emotional and pragmatic reasons to want to stay in the EU. But there is a path now, it seems, to calling a halt to all this nonsense. And it is the greatest act of national self-sabotage since Suez for this country. And if it comes down to it, my ancestors took the side of Parliament. Just so you know. Interesting times. Tumblr. Most of us know it as a kind of social media site where the social equivalent of poison arrow frogs demonstrate their hostility to everything with both their hair colour and their rhetoric. But Tumblr is a good place for two things: extremist social justice rhetoric to take the piss out of, and porn. And porn has long been Tumblr's saving grace, and probably the only thing that has really kept it that relevant as a social media site. After all, it's commenting and threading systems are screwed. It's not easily navigable. And certain communities have latched onto it despite this, and mostly because it's one of the few places online that started out with a free speech mandate and maintained that up to a point. But the writing has been on the wall for some time since Yahoo took over. They talked about wanting to censor and remove porn from the platform. They made it less searchable and caused various other issues for it, which was kind of a forewarning of what was to come. And now finally they've had the excuse that they've wanted for a long time to censor it. And that has been strong-arming from Apple. Apple complained that there were certain images appearing on the site, stuff that they were policing anyway, like child porn, but also regular porn, because Apple operates a walled garden safe environment. And so if Tumblr wanted their app to be on the Apple Store for people to download and use on their Apple products, then it had to step up its censorship game. This does not bode well for the presence of pornography, kink, adult art and so on other sites that rely on apps, such as Twitter, for example, which is still reasonably open when it comes to pornography and so on. Now, you may not be particularly sympathetic to pornography, you may consider it to be degeneracy, but this is a free expression and a free speech issue. And yes, that doesn't only apply when governments are involved, it applies whenever there's censorship. Free expression is a principle, it's not a legalistic, wholesale defined point that's only limited to when the government restricts your speech. Any restriction is censorship. Now, I think we can all agree that things like non-consensual images or child porn, which is also non-consensual, I think we can all agree that that's bad and wrong and shouldn't happen. But what if it's pretend non-consensual porn? What if it's just regular porn? What if it's pin-up images, female presenting nipples, as they said in their bizarrely Orwellian letter to their users? Tumblr's been a thriving place for the LGBTQ plus whatever community. In part, that's what's led it down that social justice type avenue, but also its openness about sexuality and pornography has contributed to that. It has a thriving kink community on it because it's one of the few big social sites that really allows them to express themselves. Erotic authors and so on often present snippets of their work and so on and do marketing on Tumblr. It's one of the few places they can be seen and get a following and get their work out there. And all of this is being swept away, and this doesn't bode well for other sites like Twitter and so on that want to be on the Apple Store, with Apple being more and more censorious and schoolmarmy as time goes on. Now here is where I would normally advocate for other sites, such as Minds. Minds is having its own censorship issues at the moment. They are flagging entire channels as adult content, even when they post adult content only in groups or already is marked as adult. This is something I've run afoul of now. So perhaps they're feeling the pressure from app stores, Android and Apple as well. So this is another point of failure. If you want your site to be a success, you need it to be as accessible to people as possible. You need your apps to be on these app stores, and there's really only two that are around that mean anything. So payment processors is an issue, one that even sites like FetLife and so on have run into. No one's willing to handle their transactions. And now app stores. And plenty of other sites and internet destinations have fallen afoul of that. People are going to be saying, you know, make your own site and so on. A lot of people aren't tech savvy enough to do that. And if someone sets up a new site, new method of blogging, a fork from Tumblr, something similar, they're just going to run into the same problems. So go make your own isn't really a practical solution in these instances. But yeah, Yahoo, who own Tumblr, have wanted to do this for a while, and they finally had their excuse, and they can blame it on somebody else, Apple, who is probably where your protests and concerns should be directed. Not that it's going to make any difference. To summarise then, if France cannot put through even modest environmentally motivated changes, what hope for the rest of us? And it is becoming more and more obvious that the climate change issue is becoming more and more pressing. If people aren't willing to take even the slightest hit to their living standards in a more socialist nation like France, then we're all fucked. Brexit, I'm hopeful that it will be overturned, but that will present its own issues. I'll be interested to see how UKIP's pro-leave rally goes and whether they get anything even remotely like the numbers that the pro-Remain rally did. And with Tumblr, it's just death by slow degrees of free expression, and particularly sexual expression on the internet. When we imagined a dystopian cyberpunk future, we used to imagine that the profit motive would be above all, and there would be massive drug use, commercialization and legalization of drugs, massive amounts of prostitution and pornography everywhere. We didn't count on corporate entrepreneurs also being moral entrepreneurs and seeking to impose their vision of what we should and shouldn't do on the products that they're selling us. It's all very peculiar. Very peculiar indeed. I'll see you soon. Zang.
Today. See, I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity.